Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining Diventures today for episode 7 of our Oceans Update webinar series. Today, we'll be talking about healthy reef systems. My name is Sabrina Severin, and I am the Ocean Health Education and Conservation Coordinator here at Diventures. And today, I'm thrilled to introduce you to our host, Dr. Alex Brylske. So Dr. Alex Brylske is the founder of Ocean Education International, which is a consulting firm focusing on environmental education and professional development for the marine tourism industry, specializing in the recreational scuba sector. He's also currently the Director of Education at Reef Smart and is the author of The Complete Diver and Beneath the Blue Planet, which both can be purchased at your local Diventures. Dr. Brylske holds a Master of Arts in Instructional Systems Design, a Master of Science in Marine Biology and Coastal Zone Management, and an EDS and PhD in Science Education with a technical specialty in oceanography. He has a unique and diverse background that combines education and marine conservation, and we are honored to share this knowledge and passion with you today. I hope you enjoy our Healthy Reefs webinar today. Dr. Brylske, take it away.
Thank you, Sabrina. Well, welcome to the new participants, and welcome back to those who've been with us before. I'm going to get right to it, and what we're going to talk about today in the news. I've selected 3 news items that are directly on point to our discussion of healthy reefs today, which is really the bulk of what we'll discuss. What exactly is the difference between a healthy and unhealthy reef? Divers often have, impressions and suspicions as to whether a reef is, healthy or not, but we're going to get into what exactly constitutes a healthy reef from one that's not. And then lastly, in the previous webinars, we've looked at destinations that were all Caribbean based. And what I want to do today is start to look into the Indo-Pacific. And given the wide range of destinations, rather than hone in on one specific, I want to look at the general differences between Indo-Pacific and Atlantic reefs. So without further ado, the 3 news items that came into play this past month or so, I'm going to talk about something called a phase shift a little bit later. And it basically is the way reefs have been changing for the past 30 or 40 years. And in addition to some corals dying prodigiously, there have been other corals that have kind of taken their place. They're very different in terms of their characteristics. They're smaller. They're brooders. For those of you who attended the coral reef seminar in the past, and unfortunately, they aren't able to make up, so to speak, for what's being lost. The second was very interesting, and this is the use of sound underwater. The silent world that Jacques Cousteau described really was inaccurate. The underwater world is quite noisy at times, so particularly in the tropics with species such as snapping shrimp and grunt, etc. And what they're finding is that healthy versus unhealthy reefs have different sounds. And I was aware of similar research in Florida Bay with sponge communities, but there's been some very interesting research in that regard. And one of the things with this sound opportunity might be to duplicate these healthy reef sounds as a way to attract coral larvae. And so it's a pretty exciting possibility. And then lastly, there was another study looking at the functional ecology of coral reefs and just why coral reef fishes have diversified to the extent that they have. And it turns out it has to do with a process we'll talk about, and that is herbivory. In other words, the plant eaters, the algae eaters. They were so fundamentally important to the evolution of coral reefs because they basically kept the substrate clean. They cleaned house, as we'll describe them in a bit. They were the lawnmowers of the reef, and allowed reefs to expand and maintain a stable environment such that the other fishes could evolve as well. Anyway, if you want to follow up on the details, there is the links to the news items and the papers that they're based on are on the website. So without any further ado, let's look at healthy reef systems. And I like to start this off by asking, what is a healthy reef? I love this photo because this is a diver who's obviously overwhelmed and enthusiastic looking at this beautiful coral head. And the problem, and I've used this image in the past, if you've been in one of the previous seminars, what he doesn't realize is he's looking at a dead reef. That coral, that elkhorn coral is long dead. It's covered with macroalgae. And so here's an instance where obviously there's no insight into what a healthy reef even looks like. And likewise, this is a famous sequence of Carey's Fort Reef taken by Dr. Phil Dustin, beginning back here in 1975. And you can see how reefs have changed fundamentally over time. And so in these images, you can see quite clearly what constitutes an unhealthy reef with the baseline of what was a healthy reef back in 1975. So this looks like a healthy reef, right? This was taken on Sand Key by one of my former students. And the unfortunate reality is it's not a healthy reef. What you're looking at in this photograph is not coral. In fact, there's no living hard coral in this entire photograph. These are organisms called zoanthids. Think of colonial sea anemones. They live within a leathery structure, and they basically are able to grow much faster than coral. So as corals have diminished, these organisms have come in and literally taken over many reefs, certainly in the Florida Keys. This is a very popular reef among snorkelers at Sand Key. So, knowing exactly what a healthy reef looks like is kind of deceiving. Here we have an example of the polythoa organism kind of encroaching upon and what we call overtopping this poor sponge. So what exactly constitutes? Well, there are certain environmental factors that come into play that are necessary for a truly healthy system. One of which is the linkages between associated ecosystems, as I'll show you in a minute, particularly seagrass beds and mangrove forests. There are some physical parameters in terms of temperature, salinity, and pH that have to be stable in order for reefs to thrive and be healthy. The coral larvae need a clean substrate, clean meaning free of macroalgae for growth and recruitment. The water needs to be unpolluted and low in nutrient, as I've mentioned in previous webinars. Remember, these are low nutrient ecosystems we're dealing with, and when we put nutrients in the water, there are problems. There has to be a functionally intact fish and invertebrate community, and I'll get into exactly what that looks like or it doesn't look like, unfortunately. So the first thing to understand is coral reefs are challenged even when they are healthy because they're under constant barrage of energy from wave action, storms, etc. But it's more than just the corals that are responsible for maintaining their integrity. And we often use this brick wall analogy. If you just piled up bricks, you might have a very robust wall, but you wouldn't have a very stable wall. You need mortar, you need stucco, etc. And the analogy is that's how coral reefs maintain their stability. The hard corals provide the blocks, but there are other organisms. As you see, there are binding agents such as the zoanthids we showed you, at least at a healthy population. The sponges help to bind. The soft corals help to baffle and reduce the energy. There are cementing critters, believe it or not, as we'll get into the various algae, as we'll talk about. As the reef is chewed by parrotfishes and urchins, etc., there's a whole bunch of aggregate or sediment that over time becomes cemented and consolidates the reef. So there's a whole host of factors that keep a reef in place, even when it's healthy, let alone when it's unhealthy. Getting back to the issue of codependence, here you have the three classic tropical marine ecosystems. You have the coral reefs, nearby seagrass beds, and then mangroves. In the lower left, you see the effect of a mangrove forest. Notice the dark water coming out of the little river there. And then as the particulate is taken up and settled in the mangroves, you have this spectacularly clear water very, very close by. And in the graphic on the right, you can see the various functions that are taking place between the three ecosystems in terms of exchanging nutrients, of providing habitat for critters at different life stages, et cetera. And we find that indeed the healthiest reefs are those that have equally healthy seagrass beds and mangrove forest in their proximity. So that's a good point to understand that, you know, all these systems are related. You've probably heard about the bleaching events occurring currently in the Florida Keys. In fact, that's where the top image was taken just 2 days ago on a reef in the Middle Keys. And you can kind of see in the lower left, the colleague sent me that picture of a bleached star coral colony. And you see her thermometer on her depth on her computer couldn't even register beyond 99 degrees. These are unprecedented temperatures. So I want to take just a minute and talk a little bit about the process of bleaching so we understand what's going on. We're going to move into this coral polyp, and you'll see we're going to go into the small tentacle, and we're going to go, you'll see the algae, the zooxanthellae. Now, the zoox, as we call them, reside in the gastrodermis. This is the internal tissue. And as you'll see when we go in, they have these photosynthetic membranes. And within the chloroplasts, there are cells, remember high school biology, the phycoid membranes. And this is where the action takes place. This is where the sunlight energizes these photosystems, and then they produce the energy necessary for the next phase of photosynthesis. When it gets too excited from too much light or too much temperature, they produce oxygen radicals, and those, just as they are in our tissues, are harmful. And so the coral spits them out. And because the zooxanthellae are the reason for the color, then the white appearance occurs because the tissue is actually translucent, and you're just looking through to the actual limestone. So that's a quick and dirty on what's actually happening in the bleaching process. But in addition to warm water, there's too much nutrient and pollution. And what I mean by that, you're seeing in the top image, this is what we call macroalgae, and you can tell it's very plant-like. It comes off easily. It's smothering the reef, and it's doing no good. Now, there are unfortunately many types of this macroalgae. This is a cyanobacteria, and when I was in high school, we called it blue-green algae. And likewise, we see here different forms. So these are signs of an unhealthy ecosystem, because if there were low nutrient conditions, this much algae simply couldn't exist. And when it gets really out of kilter, you end up with, as you see in the middle there, with that diver just pulling handfuls off of it. To add insult to injury, some places, including South Florida, still use the ocean as a toilet. This is one of 6 outfalls, 3 of which still functioning in South Florida, where partially treated sewage is pumped about 1.5 miles offshore. This is off Hollywood. And you can see from the details there in the text that it's been going on for decades. And it should be halted by 2025 due to recent legislation, but we're really not on track for that to happen. So we really can't wonder why reefs are in such poor condition when we continue to abuse reefs in this way. We call this the crappiest dive in South Florida, by the way. But not all algae are bad. Some algae are important and vital. What you see in the upper left, the CCA, it's crustose coralline algae. That is an algae, believe it or not, that threads its tissues within a limestone structure, and in the process, it acts like stucco on the reef, helping to maintain the integrity. The halimita is part of the sand aggregate that eventually, when it falls to the bottom, will consolidate and help cement the reef in together. In the upper right, we have turf algae. This is the filet mignon. This is the high nutrient, easily digestible algae that the herbivorous fish are really looking for. But on the lower right, we have a similar looking algae called wide branching or dictyota. And this is chemically defended, meaning fishes won't eat it because of the noxious taste. And of course, it simply proliferates and smothers and prevents the coral from settling or growing. By the way, the halimeda serve another important function in that some of it is washed ashore in the wave action and comprises a major, if not most, the majority portion of tropical beaches. So halimeda hash, as we call it, is important not only to the reef, but it's also important to maintaining the beaches in tropical locations. Parrotfish poo is another component. What about carbon dioxide? Well, carbon dioxide, when it enters the ocean, goes into a chemical process, briefly creating acid and dissolving things such as limestone. And so what a coral reef is all about is whether or not there's more limestone being created than limestone that's being dissolved or chewed away by the various critters. And of course, when there's more limestone accreted, the reef grows. And when there's more limestone dissolved or eroded, the reef just begins to disappear. I want to take a minute. I'm going to show you a 3-minute video because I think it's an excellent primer on ocean acidification. This is something that's very poorly understood by most individuals, but it's a relatively simple explanation that shows just why this might be an even more significant factor than warming of the ocean.
By now, you've heard that the way we're living is filling up our atmosphere with carbon dioxide. As a result, the planet's warming. Heat waves and floods are more likely to be extreme, and people's lives will get tougher. And the more we learn about climate change, the more risks we uncover. Since we started burning fossil fuels, the ocean has absorbed about half of all the CO2 we humans have put out. That's why it's called the planet's biggest carbon sink. Now, this is good because it's kept a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. But as the ocean warms, it takes up less and less CO2. And with all that CO2 in the sea, scientists are shedding light on, well, an ocean of problems. Ready for the first big problem? Some sea creatures like clams, oysters, and coral, their shells and skeletons are getting weaker. Okay, you've got bigger problems than easy to crack clams? Maybe not if you're among the 1 in 7 people who get most of their protein from seafood, or if you understand how unstable the world would be with 1 billion more hungry people. What's weakening the shells? Well, these little creatures are going about their lives scooping up molecules called carbonate ions to be the building blocks of their shells. But when CO2 reacts with seawater, it releases hydrogen ions, which compete with shells for carbonate. With more hydrogen ions floating around in the ocean, our little friends have to spend more energy building their shells and have less energy for finding food. That means it's harder to grow, and more will die off before they get big. So the fish that eat the clams or live among the coral will have a harder time surviving, meaning the fish that dine on them won't have enough to eat, and so we won't have enough to eat. Remember those pesky hydrogen ions generated by more CO2? They don't just take away the carbonate ions that these little clams need, they also make the ocean more acidic. It's already become 30% more acidic since we started spewing all this CO2, and it could get much worse. We could change the ocean's chemistry so much that shells actually start to dissolve. That means if we don't turn this problem around, your great-grandkids might think of reefs the way you think of a dodo bird. And with 1 in 4 ocean species living in coral reef ecosystems, weaker coral could threaten the foundation of the whole ocean food chain. But why panic, right? Life always seems to find a way to adapt, but it needs time. In a few decades, we might make the oceans more acidic than they've been in 20 million years. It's hard to imagine any ecosystem quickly adapting to that big of a change. But things don't have to get that bad. We've started this problem, and we're going to fix it, beginning at its source, carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. Learn more at acespace.org.
Okay. The process is very slow and over the course of decades, as you can see from these images taken on the left in 1971 through more recent times at the same locations. And so you can kind of see that it would be difficult unless you've spent decades underwater to really discern these kinds of changes. And that changing baseline concept, as we've talked about in past programs, really comes into play in this regard. So what happens when things go wrong? There's a term we use in this discussion called a phase shift. And it means whether a coral is the reef is dominated by corals or macroalgae. And you can kind of look at it like a seesaw. You want a coral-dominated state, but things such as storms, bleaching events push it toward the algal state. But in a healthy recovery process, reefs can, in fact, get back to normal. The big problem is we have other factors, acidification, as we noted, nutrients, as we'll see, and overfishing as well, kind of push that fulcrum, to the left. And as has happened in the past 30 or 40 years, have shifted reefs into this dominant state of algae. And by trying to address these factors, what we're trying to do is push that fulcrum back and put corals back into a reef-dominated state. So that's kind of an overview. So one of the things we need to do this are lawnmowers. And in a healthy reef system, we have lawnmowers. We have sea urchins. We have some species of crabs, the channel clinging crab, also called a coral crab, by the way. And then we have the vertebrates, the parrotfish, of course, the surgeonfishes, which are also herbivores, some damsels, and in the Indo-Pacific, though not the Atlantic, we have the rabbitfish family. So in a healthy system, we have all these actors munching down, keeping the reef, the algae into check. We have a stable system. Now, in the Caribbean, back in the early 80s, a undetermined disease killed off virtually almost the entire population of black spiny sea urchins. They've recovered to some extent, but in the past 2 years, there's been an outbreak of what could be a similar, though not as extensive, area. So basically, one of the most important herbivores on Caribbean reefs was extirpated in the course of a year. And Caribbean reefs, frankly, have never really recovered from this. There are also critters that you might not imagine that are potentially doing harm. And these are encrusting sponges, particularly the sponge Cyanodilactrix. It looks like from the images here that this sponge merely covers the outside. But if you look inside, as this broken coral shows, they have cells that enable them to etch internally inside and live because they don't have the algae, so that they don't need light to live. And over time, they can erode the internal structure of the reef to a point where it's weakened and will collapse from a storm event, etc. We also know that these sponges really tend to proliferate in water that's been contaminated, particularly with fecal coliform. So basically, to have a healthy coral-dominated system, you need herbivores, the lawnmowers, you need low nutrients, and you need the complexity of structure so that there's a place for things to live and to hunt. When things go wrong, when we lose the herbivores, when the reef becomes flattened due to acidification, dissolution, when we increase nutrients, then things shift to the side of an unhealthy macro image. And to add insult to injury, this also induces disease, because as that algae decomposes, it provides food for microbes that otherwise would remain in check in a normal, healthy system. The results of this have been, over the past 30 years, a whole host, about 30 diseases of coral reefs, the rogues gallery of which you kind of see here. And often it becomes very complex because these diseases sometimes, in fact, quite frequently, are the result of a combination of microbes. There could be bacteria, there could be cyanobacteria, there could be single-cell organisms, fungi, etc. And in many cases, the pathogens haven't even been identified. However, the diseases up until a few years ago tended to be slow acting and relatively stable until the stony coral tissue loss problem. This is a particularly virulent disease that tends to be 100% fatal to a colony and tends to occur over the course of a very short period. This is a poor Cylindrus, I forget the common name, pillar coral that was affected. By the way, virtually every pillar coral in the state of Florida has died as a result of this tissue loss disease. Then let's look at the food web issue. On a coral reef, there's a wide variation of menu. You can be a grazer and eat algae. You can eat some of the decaying organic matter that's left over when things die and decompose. You can eat the coral directly or the mucus it produces. You can eat plankton in the water column, or you can eat other fish. And so from the standpoint of fish, one of the ways we can look at these is, as was the subject several months back, fishes can be organized, so to speak, in terms of their food preference in what we call guilds. And the guild is nothing more than these unrelated fish eating the same thing. So you've got piscivores, you've got planktivores, you've got fish that eat, herbivores, etc. And in a healthy system, they all act as a backup, so that if one family is gone, its redundancy is there to back it up, and things just move along, hunky-dory. The problem with an unhealthy system is the result of overfishing. These various guilds can be virtually eliminated, particularly with regard to groupers and snappers. And when these guilds are eliminated, you can see there just isn't the redundancy or the ecosystem function for the reef to remain in good health. And this points up just how reefs have become overfished and the problems from it. Okay, so this I'm going to tell you later where it is, but this quick video indicates a generally healthy system, at least from the standpoint of its fish populations. Watch it, it's 25 seconds, so watch it and tell me why. You saw 3 sharks and 2 Nassau grouper at 25 seconds. If you haven't had much experience in Caribbean coral reefs, that is extremely rare to see any sharks or any Nassau grouper. So this is an indication that you probably are in a relatively healthy system. And the system happens to be La Jardines de la Reina, the Gardens of the Queen, off of Cuba, some of the healthiest coral reefs in the entire Caribbean, shot maybe a year and a half ago. So there are places where indeed there are relatively intact, healthy systems. Now, size matters when it comes to fish, because you just don't want fish that are big enough to breed. You want the big mamas. And the reason you want the big mamas is their capacity, the female's capacity to produce eggs is exponential, as you can kind of see here. In the upper image, that single grouper on the left, in terms of its size, is equal to a grouper snapper that is only 4 inches smaller. So basically, the grouper, on the upper right image, that single fish to the left has the reproductive equivalency of all of the smaller fish on the right, and similar with grouper. So bottom line, this is one of the important reasons that we want to have no-take marine protected areas. We need to protect the big mamas because they are reproductively too important to the ecosystem. Threats to coral reefs from overfishing, we don't really have time to get into, but one of the things I do want to bring your attention to is the issue of spearfishing. It's been documented in several studies that spearfishing on scuba, which is illegal or unethical in most of the world, is particularly bad because what you're doing in spearfishing, you're not fishing, you're hunting. And spearfishers are going to go after the largest fish. And when they have the assistance of an unlimited air supply, it becomes too efficient. And in fishing, one of the things you don't want to be is too efficient. So you'll see more about this issue in the future. What this gets down to is coral reefs are what we call high gross, low net in terms of their productivity. They produce lots of food, but there's not a lot left over to be harvested. As a result, coral reef ecosystems are very, very easily overfished. And in fact, in every case that I know of, they are overfished or at least completely fished. I use the analogy, coral reefs are kind of like a restaurant. Imagine a restaurant. It was enormous in size. It had an enormous staff, and it gave its staff and their families meal privileges. So they could all eat there for 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Even though they're producing lots of food, there wouldn't be much left over to sell. And that's exactly how a coral reef operates. There's relative little surplus, and hence these ecosystems are very, very vulnerable to overfishing. So, kind of in conclusion, what are some questions as you visit coral reefs that could key you into identifying it as either a healthy or an unhealthy reef? Well, first, how much of the bottom is covered by living hard coral? That's a general parameter that we use globally to kind of assess. In the Caribbean, that number is about 10%. 40 years ago, it was 50%. In Florida, before the most recent bleaching event, it was 2%. 97% of our corals were gone before the bleaching event started. Do the corals look healthy? We don't have time to get into this, but there are certain characteristics besides bleaching in terms of their potential, their disease or predation from other organisms. Are there any or many sea urchins? Sea urchins are a good sign, always. How common is fleshy algae? Are there many large, and by large, we define it by 8 inches or longer, parrotfish? Remember the importance of those lawnmowers. Are there many or any snappers and groupers? Snappers and groupers are the most desirable, valuable fish in the fishery, and therefore they're going to be targeted first. So not seeing grouper, certainly, which is unfortunately common in Caribbean coral reefs, not seeing any snapper, and not seeing fish of any size is really a strong indication that you're looking at an unhealthy reef. And then lastly, though we won't get into it here, we talked about it a few months ago, are there any sharks other than nurse sharks? Because what we now know is that the presence of sharks is critical, and it's an important factor in sustaining the fish community necessary for a healthy ecosystem. So with that, let's kind of turn to the travel log, because I'm going to pull some of these ideas into this. And as I said, rather than try to highlight a particular destination, I want to talk about the Indo-Pacific and particularly differences. What you see here are scheduled trips in the Indo-Pacific or Red Sea that Diventures has on the books now. So let's take a look at these differences, because if you've never been to the Indo-Pacific, it's a very different place. We tend to look at the tropical world, the coral reef world, in terms of these bioregions. So what we're talking about is the Indo-Western Pacific, which also includes the Red Sea, by the way. Now, here is an image showing you the species diversity. And what I want you to look at, the legend shows the darker the color, the more species. In the entire Western Atlantic, we have fewer than 80 species. In the Indo-Pacific, there are 800 species. So the diversity in terms of coral is tenfold, is a very different place. And if you note, looking at the distribution of coral reefs around the world, which is in red, you see that overwhelmingly 90% are in the Indo-Pacific and Red Sea region. So the Atlantic really doesn't have nearly the repertoire of reefs, nor anywhere near the diversity. In particular, there's a region we refer to as the Coral Triangle, depicted here. And you kind of see the borders. This is the most biologically diverse region of the entire world ocean. And the unfortunate thing, or the problematic issue, is it's also highly populated. And those people depend upon resources from the coral reefs. So it's a huge conservation challenge in helping to maintain this critically portion of the world ocean. Now, why is it that it's the Indo-Pacific? And here's a quick snippet from a longer video that kind of explains a little bit about the geologic history that kind of gets into it.
Advancing ice sheets froze coral seas, causing global sea levels to fall as much as 120 meters. In southern Asia, falling sea levels connected islands, closing ocean channels. Increasingly powerful ocean currents rush through the remaining gaps, sending corals great distances and bringing others back from far-flung reefs. When the ice melted and sea levels rose, the currents weakened and corals stayed closer to home. Over millennia, this process repeated many times. On a grand scale, the pulse of the ice ages is mirrored in the coral family tree. Strong currents caused isolated corals to return and merge again into fewer species. During ice ages, reefs were dominated by just a few corals. Right now, sea levels are high. That means corals remain isolated and they're hybridizing into more new coral species. And that's what we see.
Okay, essentially, you see that region of Earth over the period of ice ages, by the way, in the past 2.5 million years, or about 20 different ice age periods. And because this area remained viable with ocean currents and places for survival, the diversity, the evolutionary process wasn't interrupted. In the Caribbean region, of course, being so localized and small, the ice age essentially wiped out those reefs when it fell in most recently 400 feet. And so basically the Pacific has proceeded uninterrupted in terms of its evolutionary history. So there's really no question or mystery as to why those today are still the most diverse reefs. I want to show you this. This is from Apo Island. Those of you that sign up for the Philippines trip to Dumaguete, in the Atlantis Resort, you'll dive here, but you can take a look at the diversity of corals. Most of what you're seeing here are hard corals, and the coverage. This is probably 80% coral cover. You'll see this on a few places in the world. In fact, scientists in the Indo-Pacific, they don't even try to learn species. They learn corals to their genus, because the species are so similar. They can't even do it in the field in many cases. So just an absolutely, diverse system. Now, by the way, you will note here, there are not a lot of big fish. And what I was told, which makes sense, I just returned from Atlantis Resort last month. The Philippines, as all destinations, were basically closed for 2 years. And as they told me, people had to eat. And so there are a lot of big fish were taken off these reefs. However, because they're healthy, there's no reason not to expect that the fish populations will return, very, very shortly, actually. And so this is, with the exception of big fish, as I explained, all the characteristics of a healthy ecosystem. coral coverage here is it's just incredible. And of course, the thing that's not good, as I mentioned, is that, there's no large fish, and hopefully that is a temporary issue. Now let's talk about the fishes. This looks similar to the corals, and in fact, the fish diversity is also centered in the coral triangle, and less diverse as we move further off. Again, in the entire Caribbean and Western Atlantic, you have about 500 species of fish. In the Indo-Pacific, you have 6,000. 6,000. And so the diversity is quite remarkable. Now, a little bit about the differences in the diversity. Not so long ago, this is an image, an illustration of the configuration of Earth about 50 million years ago. And you'll notice what's known as the Tithe Sea. Essentially, you have a completely circumpolar tropical sea. So you could be a tropical fish in what is now Southeast Asia, and you could swim all the way around the world in tropical water. Well, something happened to alter that, called the Isthmus of Panama. And the Isthmus of Panama cut off and eliminated this circumpolar or circumglobal tropical sea. And so there's no way or from that point on, all tropical species were isolated between the Atlantic and Pacific. And then when you combine the fact that there was no opening before the Suez Canal for Red Sea organisms to get into the Atlantic, and the enormous distance between North and South America and the tropical Western Atlantic, the Pacific and Atlantic have been isolated ever since the rise of the Isthmus of Panama about 3 million years ago. Likewise, there are, the diversity in fishes is pretty remarkable. The Moorish idol on the right, quite common in the Indo-Pacific, does not occur in the Atlantic. And even the butterfly fishes, there are 120 species of those, only 12 occur in the Atlantic. And so, as I tell people, and I will sometimes encounter folks who, quote, were divers, and I have to ask them, why aren't you still a diver? And certainly one of the reasons, could be, circumstance, but I often hear, well, I got bored. And when I hear that statement, which is hard for me to believe that someone could get bored with diving, I often follow up and say, well, have you ever been to the Indo-Pacific? And often they'll say, well, no. And I tell them, quite frankly, then you've never really seen a real coral reef, because they are that different. In addition to the trips planned, as you saw at the beginning, there are plans in the pipeline to continue to expand the itineraries with Diventures throughout the tropical Western Pacific, as you see here. So stay tuned, check back at the website, etc.
Thank you, Alex. I know you mentioned that spearfishing while diving was a really big issue. I wanted to know your opinion if you spearfish while free diving, because I know you don't have an unlimited air supply, but I do still see people catch these giant fish.
Absolutely. Yeah, spearfishing, every place, like I said, in many places of the world, it is illegal to spearfish on scuba. Spearfishing, and in areas where it's legal, it's still often considered unethical. So I have enormous respect. I wish I had the athletic prowess of a free diving spearfisher. And if you can do that, more power to you. I see, my spearfishing days are long gone, but my free diving days to 60, 70 plus feet are also gone. So by all means, I wasn't lambasting spearfishing. I was just saying that doing it on scuba is just unfair. I mean, it makes for too much efficiency.
Awesome, thank you. And then my other question was, I know we talked a lot about the carbon issue and everything, and I know in the past I've learned a little bit about like trying to fight that issue, and one of those solutions kind of for the carbon offset is like taxing people and their carbon use. I just kind of wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that.
I think we'll eventually see a carbon tax. I don't see a way around that. It's going to be a long time coming, I think, for the U.S. But I think that's probably going to be a reality. But there are ways you can do that without taxation. And some of the carbon offset programs I mentioned, I think, in the last seminar that the Ocean Foundation has a carbon offset website where if you're flying somewhere, you can punch in the number of miles you're flying. That calculates the amount of carbon you're putting into the atmosphere, and then they calculate how much money one could donate to a carbon sequestration program, like a mangrove planting or seagrass planting, that would pull that amount of carbon back into and sequester it in the soil and in the plants. So there are novel ways of having a much lower carbon footprint, and I think alternative energy is already one of the fastest growing areas of economic expansion and growth. And I think you're going to see in the coming decades that all of these initiatives to not only reduce carbon, but to pull carbon back out of the atmosphere are going to be quite lucrative. And when that point hits, then things, I think, are going to change. But it has to happen. We have to do something about the carbon emissions.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have any questions on the Indo-Pacific or carbon or what we can do?
I must have done a very thorough job.
You always do. You always do a great job. I did kind of have a comment. I guess it's not really a question, but you can elaborate if you want. I'm just talking about how reefs, when they have too many nutrients and then the algae can overgrow and cause all sorts of issues. Being here in Nebraska, I know unless you're a diver, it's kind of hard to think about your impact on the ocean and our waterways because we're so landlocked, but I just know agricultural runoff is a really big issue. So it just kind of hitting on the point that even if you're not directly by an ocean, you can still be part of the problem that's harming reefs, even though we seem so far from it. Like agriculture is one of those big issues with the chemicals seeps into the ground and the water and ends up in our oceans. And
yeah, absolutely. In the very first seminar, I showed an image of the watershed of North America, and the Mississippi drains a third of the country. And what has happened as a result, in the mouth of the Mississippi, off of New Orleans, the nutrients have become so intense that a dead zone, a Noxic water, an area equal to the size of the state of New Jersey, occurs every summer. And so there's an immediate ocean consequence of agriculture. But then in the Gulf of Mexico, you have a phenomenon known as the Florida Loop Current, which swings around through the Yucatan Channel. Some of the water that comes to the Yucatan Channel immediately enters the Florida Straits and goes past the Florida Keys and becomes the Gulf Stream. But because it's such a backlog there, some of that water is focused westward, spins around Texas, the northern Gulf, and then back down the west coast of Florida. And what that means is what's coming out of the Mississippi River is coming past the Florida Keys and into the Gulf Stream. So you can't get away from the watershed. And the reason that everybody, whether they've ever seen the ocean or not, needs to recognize that there is a consequence. And to their credit, the agricultural industry has done some really good things about mitigating nutrient pollution. Basically, half of the nutrients put on farms leaves the field. But by putting barriers of plants at the stream edges and at the rivers and allowing those trees and other vegetation to absorb those nutrients, there's less put into the nearshore waters and into the stream. So there are ways to continue to farm effectively using the appropriate amount of nutrients, fertilizer, and having these mitigated areas of vegetation before the water enters the stream and river. So there are ways of doing things, and the agricultural community has done a lot, but there's just so much more fertilizer used that is necessary to grow plants. One of the downsides of it having gotten less expensive comparatively over the past several decades. Again, I would reiterate, if folks have not had a chance to dive in the Indo-Pacific, it is an absolutely mind-blowing experience in places as you saw in Apo and whatnot, and it really redefines what a coral reef is about. And I would encourage all of you to do it at least once in your lifetime.
Alex, thank you so much today for all that information. I definitely want to book a trip to the Indo-Pacific right now. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And yeah, hopefully we see you in a couple months.
Take care, folks.